Well, thank you, Karen, for that kind introduction. And I'm so happy to be with all of you today. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about advocacy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you because we have a few slides and that'll be followed by a Q&A. So here is my screen. And we're going to talk about advocacy in action. And before I really get going, I want to talk for just a second about why I wrote my book, Advocating for the Environment. And the reason I did this is because there's just so many books out there that talk about the problems we have, the climate crisis, toxics, all about the problems, but there's very little, almost nothing out there about what ordinary citizens can do about it. So I basically, having had a career in advocacy, decided to write a guidebook so that ordinary citizens could get involved in changing public policy. So that's where we're headed. And advocacy actually starts with your Earth connection stories. And well, what do I mean by that? Well, we all have stories. We all have ways that we like to connect to the Earth. And I'm guessing that all of you being in garden clubs or gardeners, and you probably have favorite gardens, favorite plants, ways that you like to connect to the Earth. I certainly do. In fact, one of the things I love to do is plant zinnias. I like to plant an open pollinated variety because when they come up, you get all different colors, orange, pink, red, white, and you get singles and doubles. And I just love seeing what comes up. And that kind of gives me the joy and that connection to the Earth, which is one of my Earth stories. Now, Earth stories can be both positive or negative. Perhaps there's a lake in your area that gets algae or bacteria in the warm weather. Sometimes our Earth stories are about loss as well as love. So what is it that these Earth stories do for us? Well, what they do is they ground us in our deepest truth. And honestly, advocacy work can be tough going at times. And so it's those stories, those Earth connections that motivate you, sustain you, and remind you of why you're doing all of this work, right? And then, of course, Earth stories can also connect directly to a public policy issue, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So the power of your story in advocacy is that it creates a human connection with decision makers. It cuts through all that opposition, those entrenched beliefs, and it creates a platform for dialogue and change. And going even further, it shines a light on the truth. And a great example of that is fracking in Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, the oil and gas industry convinced the state legislature there to allow fracking anywhere. You could frack in a schoolyard or a public park anywhere. And the industry said, fracking isn't dangerous. It happens deep underground, so you can't even see it. Well, it took citizens coming forward and saying, my well is contaminated. My farm animals are dying. There's toxic chemicals from fracking in the water. And it wasn't until the citizens came forward and told the truth that these policies around fracking were changed. So there's just a great example. There are many, many examples of how your own personal experience and stories can change public policy. So there are two ways to use stories in advocacy. And the first, of course, is to internally ground and center you, which we've just talked about. The second is to show, I also just talked about, how ordinary people are affected by public policy. And a nice example is Fred Stone, which many of you probably have never heard of Fred, but he has quite a story, and his story actually started a movement. So what happened to Fred was he is a dairy farmer in southern Maine, a third-generation dairy farmer, and he was doing a great business. It was going well. But he had used municipal sludge on his farm fields as a fertilizer. And after he'd been doing this for some years, it turned out that there were toxic chemicals in the sludge. And very unfortunately for him, he lost his farm, he lost his business, and basically lost everything. And even he and his family members have toxic levels of a chemical called PFAS in their blood. And it was, came from that sewage sludge. Well, what Fred did was really courageous. He went to a legislative committee and told his story about what happened to him and his farm. And in doing that, he started a movement. And here in Maine, we've banned PFAS chemicals in all kinds of products. And now there are 15 states across the country working on the same issue. And even the EPA is talking now about how to eliminate these chemicals. So it took Fred and his story coming forward to get this public policy change to start moving forward. So citizen voices are so important. In fact, I cannot emphasize this enough, because corporate leaders and politicians, we'd love to have them stick their neck out and do the right thing and be leaders, but they really can't do it without your support behind them. They just can't. And so that's what we need. We need citizens to come forward and give them the support so they can take the lead. And the thing is citizens do not speak up. What we get is corporate policies. And the reason I say that is because they're paid corporate lobbyists who are working full time to write legislation and pass it. And so if citizens don't speak up, what do we get? We get the corporate policies, and the environmental injustices just grow. So really what I'm saying is that decision makers need you. Without your stories and experience, they won't know the impact of their decisions. So your job as a citizen is to take an abstract concept. Any kind of a bill is abstract, right? I mean, the Great American Outdoors Act, which the GCA worked to pass earlier this year, or actually last year now, it's abstract. It needs, the decision makers need to hear your experience and how you're affected by these laws in order to understand it. And finally, of course, your perspective, especially if it helps solve a problem, is really a gift to decision makers. And so citizens really are much more powerful than they think they are. And they need to speak up at all levels: neighborhood, town, state, and national. And the point is, you don't need to be an expert. You just have to say that you care and why. I mean, it's wonderful if you have expertise, if you have facts you can use, but really just saying you care and telling your story is enough. And one of the things that I hear, in fact, I heard this from a legislature the other day, is that what they really remember are the stories. This legislator said to me, after all the testimony and all the reports and facts and everything, when I went to vote, when I go to vote, it's really the stories that people have told me that stick with me. And there's a quote here on this slide about the same thing. Those are the things that stick, are your stories. So let's take a quick look at some environmental history here. So back in 1969, families would sit around in the evenings together and watch the television news. And this was a new thing back then. And there were several pivotal events that happened in 1969, and here they are. There was a devastating oil spill off of Santa Barbara, California. It spilled 3 million gallons of crude oil. There are pictures of wildlife covered with oil on the evening news, as you see here. Also that year, the Cuyahoga River, which is near Cleveland, Ohio, it caught fire. Well, it had caught fire actually many times before, but it wasn't until it was captured on the TV news that people became really aware of it. And similarly, smog over Los Angeles was covered on television, and you couldn't see the mountains surrounding that city in the television coverage of the smog. So as a result of these events, basically the first Earth Day was created on April 22nd, 1970. With 20 million Americans participating across the country. It was a really incredible event. And what came out of that is amazing. So here it is. Big policy changes came right after Earth Day. In fact, 28 major environmental laws were passed between 1970 and 1980. And this is just a sampling of them on this slide that you can see. And these will be familiar to you: the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. I mean, basically all of the environmental law that our law is based on today was created between 1970 and 1980, and it was all a result of that very first Earth Day. So here's an interesting comparison then. So in 1970, 20 million Americans participated on Earth Day, representing 10% of the US population at the time. Well, the climate strikes in 2019, which is the largest event we've had recently, only 4 million Americans participated, and our population has grown, so that only represents 1.8% of the current US population. So we basically don't have as much participation now as we did in 1970, and at the same time, the issues have become more intense. So that Santa Barbara oil spill that was so devastating was 3 million gallons. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil platform blew up in the Gulf of Mexico. Many people here all remember that. That was 134 million gallons. So not only has participation declined, but the intensity of the environmental events, the environmental disasters we're experiencing, has gone up. So the key question is, can we create the critical mass like we had on the first Earth Day? And I believe the answer is yes, and I'm going to tell you why I think so. So here's a quote that I love: "Power is infinite." This was said by Eric Liu. Eric was a senior advisor to President Obama. He's an educator, a speaker, and a really wonderful author. He wrote this book, You're More Powerful Than You Think. But what does Eric mean by power is infinite? Well, here it is. Citizen power comes from two different sources. One, of course, is your personal power. We've talked about that with your stories, your commitment, your experience. That's what grounds you in your personal power. But what Eric Liu is referring to when he says power is infinite is organizing power, the power of people to organize, the power of numbers, the power of taking action. And it is just incredible how many stories there are throughout history where groups of people have organized and taken their power and gone forward. An example I love to cite about that is the tomato pickers in Florida, because this group of people was about the least empowered group of people you can imagine. They didn't speak English. They had terrible working conditions. They lived in shacks on the sides of the field with no indoor plumbing, no facilities whatsoever. And they decided to organize, and they organized and they boycotted Heinz products. They had faith-based groups who supported them. And really in a pretty short time, like really about 3 or 4 years, they had gotten everything they were looking for. They got benefits, they got plumbing, they got better housing, they got better hours. So even the least empowered people can organize and make a change happen. So that is the power that is infinite. It's the power of organizing. So I always like to clarify for people a little bit about advocacy and direct action, because sometimes people can be confused about this. So advocacy is building relationships with decision makers. And in doing this, you're working inside the system. You're educating, giving information, asking decision makers to do what you want them to do. Direct action, on the other hand, is more about speaking out publicly. And you do this when an issue needs to be raised up, when there's not been enough attention on an issue. And there you're working outside the system. You're also educating and providing information, but the point is different. You're trying to gain attention for an issue as opposed to work with a decision maker. So just as an example to help think about this is the climate summit in Glasgow that was held back in November. So at Glasgow, an advocate example is John Kerry, right? So John Kerry was working really hard behind the scenes. He was working with all sorts of countries to help get them to increase their commitment. He was negotiating, he was trying to get things done that way. Well, the direct action side would be represented by Greta Thunberg, right? So she comes to the summit and she's basically angry that things are not happening fast enough. She gets a lot of media attention. It's good, but she's not the one behind the scenes doing the actual advocacy and building those relationships. So that's just an example to give you an idea of this. And the other thing to say about it is that both advocacy and direct actions are important and they're needed, and different people feel drawn to different activities. So some people that might be drawn to direct action, others to advocacy, and that's okay. We need everybody to play with different roles and to be doing the things that they're most comfortable doing. So let's go talk about building relationships, because you're going to be working with your congressional delegations really soon, next week, I understand. And so how do you build relationships with decision makers? Well, it's all about listening. It's about listening to their questions and concerns and responding to them. It's about engaging, and it's about treating them with care. And as I put this talk together, I was thinking about this because I thought, who could be better at building relationships than GCA members, right? I mean, you've joined a garden club because you want to be building relationships. You want to listen to people and engage and treat people with care. So I think, you're almost the perfect group to be going and talking to those decision makers on the Capitol Hill, because it's all about building relationships, which I am sure you already know how to do. So the important thing you're going to do when you go to Capitol Hill is make an ask. So you need to be thinking very clearly about what it is you're going to ask these decision makers to do. And in doing that, you want to be saying why this issue is important to you. And what is your ask? And then who's included? Who's supporting this? All of your members in your state, perhaps. And of course, you always want to thank decision makers for their time and attention. The other thing too about relationships and advocacy is you want to do everything you can to build a relationship that's based on trust. Well, how do you do that? Well, one thing it starts with is doing your homework. You need to do your research. You need to understand where your decision makers are on this issue. What is their track record? What have they voted for in the past? You also need to be honest and address both the pros and cons. And I know it's really easy to want to talk about all the really good things that can happen if they pass this piece of legislation. And I often feel like I just don't want to talk about any negative consequences or what is the actual cost of this going to be or whatever. But actually, you'll engender more trust if you cover all of the pros and the cons. It just works better that way. Don't hide anything. Don't minimize anything. So of course, you want to have an upbeat attitude, a spirit of helpfulness. You also want to be really willing to track down the answers. If a decision maker asks you a question, you want to make sure that you follow up and follow through and do what you say you're going to do. And that really helps to build trust. So let's talk for a second here about having a vision. And the reason I bring this up is because environmentalists are often accused of being against everything, right? Against coal, against fossil fuels, against toxic chemicals, all of that kind of thing. Well, that's just fine, except in order to move these issues forward, you need to be thinking about what are you for? Where are you trying to actually go? What is the future that you want to create? And in my book, actually, I have 2 chapters on vision, which I hope you might take a look at. But basically, where I'm coming from is that I want to imagine a future where all life is respected, revered, and nurtured. I mean, I can just imagine the planet being healthy, where everyone has an opportunity to succeed and where people are working together peacefully to create solutions. So I have a vision about where we're trying to go. And it really, like my stories, it helps ground me in why I'm doing this work. So you might want to think about your vision and how you would describe that and use that too as a way to motivate yourself in doing advocacy work. So another thing I want to say is that we know we're living in turbulent times, right? I mean, we've seen, COVID, we've seen polarization, we've seen difficult political gridlock in Congress. But what I want to say to you is that this actually represents an opportunity. So whenever major social change happens, it almost always comes out of the times of turbulence, really. And if you think back to the 1960s, not only was there all this environmental activity, but we're talking about the 60s, it was protests against the Vietnam War. It was about the civil rights movement. It was about the women's movement, and it was about the environment. And during that time of turbulence, a lot of positive change emerged, right? So we had the Civil Rights Act was passed, the war was ended, women made a lot of advances in the workplace and in society as a whole. And then, of course, all of the environmental laws that we looked at earlier were created. So I think we're in a similar time. I think we're in a time now where these disruptions can actually be an opportunity for us to move forward in a positive way. And it really encourages me that we're seeing Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ issues and all kinds of other issues at the same time that we're seeing the climate crisis, because what this does is it creates the platform for creating a whole new way of seeing our society, one that is more equitable, one that is more healthy for the planet. So we've got a huge opportunity here. But the key to it is, it's not going to happen by itself. We have to act. We have to act together, and we have to affirm and support life on Earth. And I'm really pleased, actually, that the Garden Club of America is working on this and going to Capitol Hill, because this is actually what we have to do to create the world that we want to have, right? So I'm so excited that you're doing the work that you're doing. And with that, I want to say, I wish you the best of luck on the Hill. I know most of this is going to be over Zoom, but that's okay. I think you can be very effective over Zoom. And I wish you the best of luck in your work with your congressional delegation. And I can't wait to hear how it turns out. So with that, I will finish my remarks, and I believe we're going to have a little bit of time for some questions and answers. Here's my contact information. I welcome your reaching out to me and would be happy to hear from you. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Sue. I feel like I'm inching towards more confidence in developing a relationship with my legislators, which can really be very intimidating. I know that I need to remember that they wanted this job, they ran for office, so they want and need to have a relationship with us, and they want and need to work with us and for us. So if we can just springboard off that line of thinking as we introduce ourselves and work together to make our case for conservation, then we will be better advocates for the environment. We have lots of questions for you today, so let's see if we can just get to a few. Our first question is, we have these talking points for each bill the GCA supports. How do we work those into our personal stories to create a citizen voice when talking with our decision makers?
Thank you, Casey. That's a great question. So I know that there's going to be some planning activities where individuals are assigned to different talking points, and there'll be some choreography to how your Zoom meetings with your legislators, your congressmen are going to go. And what I would say to that is that you can work in your personal stories into those talking points. So for example, if you are advocating for the Trillion Trees Act, you might talk about how that act would be helpful in your state or your region, right? So if it's a dry area, you've had fires, those trees can actually, hold more moisture in the environment for you. So that's how you do it. You think about, the legislation at hand and how would that affect you in your area? And I think you can do that. I think that, as I say, different individuals will probably be focusing on different talking points. And those individuals can think about, how does this affect my community or my region or my state? And you definitely want to bring that in so that the decision makers can see that, how that policy is going to affect you and your area and your community.
Yeah, I see that. I see what you're saying. It's just like keep it real, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You have a story, tell your story.
It's not rocket science. In fact, it's kind of fun to work on that aspect of it, to bring those stories out.
So what happens when you're talking to people and they have an opposing view to yours and they make it known? How do you handle that?
Yeah, this is one of the most frequently asked questions I get when I do talks or when I'm teaching. And the key to it really is to speak to people's experience. You want to avoid speaking to political talking points if you're in a place where you're in a disagreement, but instead say something like, well, have you noticed any changes in the weather? Is it drier or wetter than it used to be? And if so, why do you think that is? And if you can start talking about experiences and stay off of politics, you can often open up a conversation with people that have a totally different political view.
Okay, well, what if my congressperson or their staff opposes our issue, like just says, no, we're not doing that? What do you do?
Yeah, that's an interesting situation, because that's actually, it can be a gift to you, because what you want to find out is, what are their concerns? What are they? Because that's a clue to what work you need to do. So if they're concerned about, let's say the cost of a certain issue, then you need to find that out. And then you need to do some research and figure out what the actual cost is, or is there a way to fund it that's different, or how can you address their concern? So when a staff person or a congressperson presents a question or a concern or opposition, you definitely want to dive right in and find out what that's about, because that's telling you what you need to do in order to get your bill across the line, or in order to get their support. Not that you can 100% of the time win their support, but it's absolutely, you want to try to. And that concern is really a key to what you need to do to get them to come around.
Well, Sue, my big takeaway is just be you, because they're going to love you. Mm-hmm. And remember that we have the power to make a difference by being ourselves and telling our true story.
Yes.
Thank you again for your leadership and your wise advice and counsel on all of this. You're demystifying so much of this for us and our membership. And I want to remind everybody that information about where to purchase Sue's book is on the GCA website. It's included in the NAL resources page. And Sue, once again, thank you again.
Well, it's been a pleasure to visit with you, and I'm sorry I can't see everyone on Zoom, but I know you're out there, and I'm really excited about the work you're doing. So go forward and get it done.
Thank you.